As you know, we're in the middle of a series on the book of Exodus as we follow the Hebrew people on their journey from Egypt to the Promised Land. And it's an important journey because as they leave Egypt, they don't go straight there. They go to Sinai where they have this encounter with God. And that is the importance of what we're looking at and why we want to study this as a church, to go when God takes us from one place to another. He doesn't just take us the shortest way. He takes us to a place to encounter Him, to grow, and to learn from Him and become more of the people He wants us to be. So we started our journey with looking at Egypt had been the place of promise. It had been not the ultimate promise, but a place of provision and a place where God wanted His people to be, to keep them safe, to have them survive a famine. And God provided that for them. He sent Joseph ahead to prepare it for them. And it was a good place and very much a God place for them to be. But then they settled and they stayed. And as they stayed, they became slaves. And they weren't just slaves for a few years. They stayed in Egypt for 430 years. And in that amount of time, the identity of slavery took over. These were people who didn't understand what it meant to be God's people, His chosen people, the family that God loved and was going to bless the world through. They were people who knew how to be one thing, and that was how to be slaves. And so they stayed and they cried out. And then we looked in the second week about the fact that God provided them a leader, and He sent Moses for them. Somebody who God humbled. God said, you've got the call, you've got the passion, you've got the desire for this, but I need to teach you how to do it. And so Moses had to leave Egypt and spent 40 years tending sheep, to the point where when God said, now it's time to go back to Egypt and lead my people, Moses had no confidence anymore because he didn't see himself as somebody who could do that, who was a good speaker. And God says, no, but I am with you. And so Moses goes and he has his brother Aaron to help. And they go and they confront Pharaoh. And we looked at the plagues, and we looked at this idea that the plagues aren't simply God punishing the Egyptians. What they're actually doing is creating an environment where the Hebrew people can't stay in Egypt anymore. It's impossible for them to stay because the animosity that's building between Pharaoh and the Egyptians is reaching a climax. And these Hebrew people who were used to being slaves, and actually, while they didn't like it, were fairly comfortable with that, it became so uncomfortable they had to go. I think it's an important thing to know that God actually, as He brings the plagues, you can study the fact that each of the plagues corresponds with a member of the Egyptian pantheon of gods. And you can see this thing that God doesn't just say, I'm going after Egypt. He says, I am going after all their gods and proving that I am greater and stronger and more powerful than any of them. And as Jonathan pointed out, the first couple of plagues, the Egyptian magician said, well, we can do the same thing. But then they couldn't anymore. And then the plagues were even on everybody. And then as you got further on, God said, okay, well, the plague is only going to be on Egypt, but not on my own people. And you started to see God was unbelievably powerful. And that's a significant thing, because while we know God is powerful, it was important for the people to recognize that God was able to solve their problems. But His solution wasn't, let me hammer Egypt into submission so you can stay in Egypt. Let me defeat all the powers that surround Egypt so that you can enjoy your life there. He says, I'm going to prove I am superior to anything that's here, and I'm still going to get you to leave. And that's a really important thing, that they didn't leave because God wasn't powerful enough to make where they were work. They left because God had a better purpose for them and a better place for them. And so the people leave. And as they get, and God leads them not directly to the promised land, and He says, if I take them through the Philistine territory, there might be a battle. And if these people face a battle, they will run. And he knows that because their identity is that of being slaves. They don't have a strong constitution that says we can do this, God will fight for us and do anything. They only know how to submit to forces that look stronger than they are. And so God takes them a different route, and he takes them down into the wilderness, and they come to the edge of the sea, and they've got cliffs on one side and the sea on the other. And at that moment, Pharaoh and his army come toward them, and they start to complain, and they panic, and they say, Moses, why did you bring us this way? And Moses says, and he looks to God, and God says, I will make a way. And that's an important thing, is that sometimes God leads us to places where it looks like there's no way through. And he does it to show us that he's the one who will make a way through, as opposed to we need to come up with a solution. He says, if I led you here, I have a solution. And sometimes it's not a solution that you will ever think of or see, because I can do more than you can ask or imagine. And so the waters part, and the people walk through on dry ground, and they are safe. And then the waters close and destroy the Egyptian army that's chasing them. And they recognize there is incredible freedom, and that they have a new start. They are in a new place. They do not have this threat that Egypt is going to come after them and get them anymore. And in that place, they begin to worship. And so we're going to pick up this week in Exodus chapter 16, which you can follow along with. And it says, the whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had come out of Egypt. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are going to go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this way I will test them to see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will see that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. In the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? Moses also said, you will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening, and all the bread you want in the morning, because he has heard your grumbling against him. Who are we? You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the entire Israelite community, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling. While Aaron was speaking to the whole Israelite community, they looked toward the desert, and there was the glory of the Lord appearing in the cloud. Then the Lord said to Moses, I have heard the grumbling of the Israelites. Tell them, at twilight you will eat meat, and in the morning you will be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. That evening quail came and covered the camp, and in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp. And when the dew was gone, thin flakes like frost on the ground appeared on the desert floor. When the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? For they didn't know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Everyone is to gather as much as they need. Take an omer for each person you have in your tent. The Israelites did as they were told. Some gathered much, some little. And when they measured it by the omer, the one who had gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Everyone had gathered just as much as they needed. Then Moses said to them, no one is to keep any of it until morning. However, some of them paid no attention to Moses. They kept part of it until morning, but it was full of maggots and began to smell. So Moses was angry with them. Each morning, everyone gathered as much as they needed, and when the sun grew hot, it melted away. On the 6th day, they gathered twice as much, 2 omers for each person. And the leaders of the community came and reported this to Moses. He said to them, this is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath for the Lord. So bake what you want to bake, and boil what you want to boil. Save whatever is left, and keep it until morning. So they saved it until morning, as Moses commanded, and it did not stink or get maggots in it. Eat it today, Moses said, because today is a Sabbath to the Lord. You will not find any of it on the ground today. 6 days you are to gather it, but on the seventh day, the Sabbath, there will not be any. Nevertheless, some of the people went out on the seventh day to gather it, but they found none. And then the Lord said to Moses, How long will you refuse to keep my commands and my instructions? Bear in mind that the Lord has given you the Sabbath. That is why on the 6th day he gives you bread for 2 days. Everyone is to stay where they are on the 7th day. No one is to go out. So the people rested on the 7th day. The people of Israel called the bread manna. It was like coriander seed and tasted like wafers made with honey. Moses said, This is what the Lord has commanded. Take an omer of manna and keep it for generations to come, so they can see the bread I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt. So Moses said to Aaron, Take a jar and put an omer of manna in it. Then place it before the Lord to be kept for generations to come. As the Lord commanded Moses, Aaron put the manna with the tablets of the covenant law so they might be preserved. The Israelites ate manna for 40 years until they came to a land that was settled. They ate manna until they reached the border of Canaan. There's a funny line in this passage. It says, When the Israelites saw the manna, they said to each other, What is it? For they didn't know what it was, which may seem like a strange thing that you need to point out. Why do you need to point out they don't know what it is? They've just asked, What is it? But what is it? We can ask in a few ways. We can say, What is this? Or we can say, What's this? And when you ask, What's this? It's usually because it's a rhetorical question, and you know exactly what it is. If you're walking down the pavement, and there's a giant pile of dog poo right in your way, we can sit there and look at it and going, What's this? We know it's poo. What we're really saying is, why is this on the pavement? Why is it in my way? Because someone is supposed to have cleaned this up and not left it for me to potentially step in. And the Israelite people, as they leave Egypt, seems to ask, What's this? An awful lot. They arrive at the Red Sea, and there's no way to cross. And they go, Moses, what's this? They cross the Red Sea, and they arrive at a spring of water, and the spring doesn't taste very good. And they're like, Moses, what's this? They leave the springs and get further into the desert. And they're like, We've got no food. Moses, what's this? So eventually, when God provides for them, it's important to point out that they say, What is it? Because they actually don't know. And that's different from their complaining. And often, we take it for granted that we have the right to complain about things. We look at things don't work out the way we want them to do, and we start going, What's this? And instead of actually having a questioning attitude, we have a rhetorical attitude. We know exactly what we think it is, and we're not asking a question that we want an answer for. We're asking a question that we want everyone to know our opinion on. And so, as we go through a journey where we're actually going to discover new things, I think it's really important for us to actually watch how we ask, What's this? Is this something God's doing? And we actually need to find out what it is and what He has for us. Or are we asking, What's this? Meaning, this isn't the way I would like it done. The other thing that's important to look at is who they're grumbling against. The people seem to think they're grumbling against Moses and Aaron, and they keep addressing their complaints to Moses and Aaron. Why have you brought us out of here? Why are you doing this? But Moses is quick to point out, who are we? You're not grumbling against Aaron and myself, you're grumbling against God. And he points that out quite clearly, and it's important because the people can see that they have been following Moses and Aaron, and they blame Moses and Aaron for where they are. But they can clearly see that Moses and Aaron aren't just leading them blindly, they're following God. And there is a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire at night, and it moves. And as it moves, the people follow. And so everyone has the ability to follow God where He's leading there. And we all have the ability to follow God where He leads. But sometimes it's really easy to ignore the fact that God is leading something and instead focus on the fact that there's a person, and we can blame that person if we don't like the way things work out. And that's a really important thing that I think Moses addresses really clearly with the people. He says, stop grumbling against Aaron and myself. You're actually grumbling against God. The other thing that's important to look at is why. Why does God give them manna? And there's a simple answer: they're hungry. And God provides. God loves to provide for us, and He does. But He does it in strange ways sometimes, and He does it in those ways for very specific reasons. And God's quite clear on His reasons. Moses summarizes it in the book of Deuteronomy, and he says, remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep His commands. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And we can see how this works. God gives them the food, but He gives them instructions. He says, you have to go out every day and collect it, but only collect enough for that day, except on the 6th day, where you collect twice as much as you need. And if you collect too much on one of the earlier days and try to keep it, it spoils, it gets smelly, it gets maggots in it, and it's no good. And there's a sense of anger. It's like, I've told you, don't gather more than you need. I'm going to give it to you every day. And then on the 6th day, gather twice as much, because on the 7th day there won't be any. And some people go out and they try to gather it on the 7th day, and there's none. And God gets upset. He says, how long are you going to do this? How long are you going to stop following my instructions? And He's trying to teach people something very important. He's trying to teach them how to get back to relying on Him. Because God created us, people, to be reliant on who He is. We're not meant to be independent people who just do our own thing and only think of God when there's an emergency. He wants us to get into this daily rhythm of relying on Him, that we can come and say, God, today, this is what I need. It's why He teaches us in the Lord's Prayer. Jesus says, give us today our daily bread. He wants us to get into this rhythm of going, today has what I need. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus clearly says, don't worry about tomorrow. There are enough worries in today. And He wants us to focus. We need to trust that God is a loving Father, that He will provide for us. And we don't need to be thinking tomorrow, the day after that, what's going to happen, because He cares about that. He says, focus on today. Live today. Live in the moment. Know that I can provide for you today, and I will provide for you tomorrow. And when I say, okay, today gather twice as much, because the day after there won't be any, we need to be quick to respond to that. And so God starts to teach His people how to do that. And He develops a rhythm, and I'm sure they eventually get into it, but at the start it becomes difficult because they're used to going, we have no food. If we have no food, we need to hoard as much as they can and save it for when we don't have it. And God says, don't do that. It's going to go off, and it does go off, and it's not good for them. And so they go, okay, some of them get used to that. And then when it comes to the 7th, they go, wait, why didn't you do that? And God says, I told you it wasn't going to work that way this time. You need to keep listening. You need to keep following my instructions. And so, as we're in this season, God has things that He wants to provide for us. And we need to be open and accepted and go, instead of thinking, how can we go, oh, God's providing, how do I structure this to make this last for the next year? He goes, no, enjoy it for right now. This is what it is. Appreciate the provision I'm giving. Get the most out of it. But don't look about how this will work tomorrow. Look at how it works for today. And that can be a real challenge because we like to plan. We like to be independent. We like to say, I can take care of myself, and God, thank you for taking care of me when I need it, But the rest of the time I'm good. And what God actually wants to do is to get us back to a place where we're dependent on Him, where we say, He's our Father. And now that I've got 4 children, I'm a little better at understanding what that means, because my kids aren't thinking about how they plan up for the rest of the week. They seem to expect that Veronica and I are going to feed them. And if we don't feed them, they'd be quite shocked at that. And God wants us to be like that. He wants us to expect things from Him, not to take Him for granted. We need to be thankful and when we receive, but to say, God, I know this is who you are. I know you will take care of me. And that's a challenge. I know for me, I much prefer to plan ahead. I much prefer to say, I know what I'm going to be doing. I know where this is coming from. I have a plan. But God doesn't want always me to have a plan. Sometimes He gives me a plan. But He wants me to look to Him first as opposed to myself. And that is the main reason, I think, why God gives manna. And it's why Jesus quotes it later. When Satan tempts Him, He says, if you're hungry, turn that stone into bread. And Jesus says, but don't you know? Man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And He says it's that command from God and following His instruction that ultimately gives more nourishment than actually taking care of yourself and meeting your own needs. So as we move forward in this, we need to start looking, how is it that we get out of this? How do we meet our own needs? And looking to go, what is God doing now? And when we see what He's doing, instead of going, what's this? Why would you do it this way? This isn't the way I like it. But to go, God, what is it? What is it you have for me? Let's change our hearts. Amen.